Hello, everyone. Welcome, and we have about a minute before we will start. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a good number of attendees joining us today. Welcome. If you don't mind, we would ask that you take a moment to answering the polling question that showed up on your screen. And while you're doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about our process for today. My name is Audrey Snyder, and I'm the Associate Dean for Experiential Learning and Innovation at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. I'm also the president of the Rural Nurse Organization, and I will be your moderator for our session today. We thank you for joining us for the Global Rural Nurse Exchange Network webinar, which is going to be 1 hour in duration. So I want to give you a little bit of context. We are recording this session. So if you're not able to join us the entire time, or if you want to share this with others afterwards, we will send you a link to the recording as well as the slide deck afterwards. We are using the webinar platform today, so that means the speakers will not be able to hear or see you as an attendee. But please feel free to submit any questions you have via the Zoom question and answer feature. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, it should be to the right of middle, the most right button, unless you were to click leave the screen. We'll do our very best to answer as many questions as possible during the session. You'll also be given the opportunity to provide us with some feedback about today or to ask additional questions after the session ends. Our speakers have agreed to stay on the call for 15 minutes after the presentation is over, and if we haven't answered your questions at that point, they will have the opportunity to do so. So let's talk about how this will go. First, I want to welcome you and thank you. This has been really an effort from the heart by many people and organizations to really put together our first global rural nursing exchange network called Subjects That Matter Most series. And our goal is to present subjects that really matter most, with hosting speakers and content experts that really will provoke some important discussions that are critical to nurses working in the rural context. We want to provide a platform where you can share your experiences and provide opportunities for rural nurses, nursing students, educators, and researchers from around the globe to experience other cultures while collaborating to improve the health of rural communities. The Global Rural Nurse Exchange Network actually works in collaboration with the Rural Nurse Organization and was created based upon the belief that we are providing a forum that encourages global diversity and invites multiple perspectives. And with this, we can improve decision-making and progress on issues that really matter to rural nurses and rural communities around the globe. So next, we're going to hear from two wonderful speakers who will guide us through some very interesting information about these trying times that we're all living through and have experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. And last, we plan to wrap up about 12:55 with some closing comments. So I'm going to move forward with introducing our two speakers for today. So we do have with us today Dr. Jeffrey Leiker, who is a licensed psychologist and the lead administrator for behavioral health integration for Sanford Health. And his colleague who is joining us is Rich Prushrer, who is a licensed professional clinical counselor also with Sanford Health and is the director of patient and community education department. So I'm going to turn it over to Rich and let's all enjoy the presentation today. Thank you. There will be a moment as the slides switch over to their slide deck, so don't think that you are losing us. Just bear with us for a moment as our IT staff actually move us along.
Well, thank you, Audrey. As we move to the next slide deck, I'll just mention on behalf of Jeff and I how humbling it is and grateful we are to be able to present this information today. We're hoping that it'll be helpful and that we'll have a good generative conversation through the chat and the Q&A as we go here. So again, the title of our presentation is Finding Your Wellbeing PPE, which we say stands for Personal Protective Emotions in Trying Times. And we'll just quickly cover a little bit of a roadmap of where we want to go today. We're going to present some data from a large survey of nurses in the United States and talk about the data that suggests that certainly this pandemic has been a real hardship for nursing, and we'll talk about some of the nuances of that. Then we'll move into one model of well-being. There are many out there. We're going to focus on one that has about 6 core elements, and then really encourage gently those of you on the webinar to reflect and consider if there's an area or a couple of areas that you would like to begin to put some focus and energy around for your well-being. And then lastly, we'll tie it in with recognizing opportunities for growth despite and in the midst of the challenges of COVID-19. So first, just a little bit about the organization that Jeff and I represent, Sanford Health. We have a presence in about half of the states in the United States. You can see from this slide kind of the reach and the size and the number of services that our organization covers. We've had a merger with the Good Samaritan Society from a couple of years ago, so have a full scale and breadth to senior care services. So you can kind of see just at a glance that we also have a global reach with some clinics out in the world. And just wanted to give you kind of an overview of our organization. Now, to kind of move into the presentation and really to get the best out of our time together, we really welcome you, those of you on this webinar, to take this time for you. We don't want this to be a typical Zoom meeting. We have lots of distractions in healthcare, and we would welcome you to unplug a while during our time together. If you can, silence your phone, close out of your email. Just try to really unplug from distraction and try to stay fully present in the moment in our time together. You are worth it. And at times we're going to present content that lends itself to some self-reflection, some pausing. And so some of you might want to grab a pen and a piece of paper and be able to kind of jot down some of your reactions and some reflection there. So if that's helpful for you, feel free to do that. And really some of these concepts do require a little bit of time and kind of to process and to sit with for a little bit. So feel free to engage with it at the best way that you would like to do that. Next, we're going to move to what is pretty standard when we jump on an airplane. And that's that safety message. That's a routine and a rule and a law that needs to be covered with all of us so we can be safe in an emergency on an airplane. And I think there's some real wisdom here in that if we want to take care of others, you have to take care of yourself. So the instructions we get are put your mask on first, and then you can help other people on the airplane. And so that's been a very powerful, I think, prevailing message during this pandemic. And how do we recognize that? How do we be intentional about that? And it's hard. We recognize that. So self-care is paramount, and it's directed first and foremost in taking care of ourselves. So we're going to ask you to reflect on your health and well-being from the past year or so since March of 2020, and what things are like for you today. So first, we'll take a look back even a little bit further. And this slide is just a quick summary of the research out there on the prevalence of burnout, depression, and anxiety in nurses. And we would just say that overall, there's a real significant range in terms of prevalence in the literature. And that has to do with the screener that was used, the definition of the variables the parts of the world that a study was taken. But I think overall, we see that the prevalence of these conditions and problems are relatively high and concerning, and that was before COVID. There's one study that suggests that depression rates amongst nurses is about twice that of the general population. And there are a number of other studies that show prior to COVID that there are some real concerns with the prevalence on some of those issues. And now we'll move over to Jeff, who's going to talk a little bit about the psychological phases of disaster.
Thank you, Rich, and good afternoon or good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. I just echo Rich's remarks that we are very humbled to be here to share some information with you. Really want to give a shout out to some of the folks outside the United States who are joining us. Thank you. I know that is a particular challenge in some cases. So, it was about 13 months ago when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a worldwide pandemic. And if in the last 13 months, any of you have felt like you've been on a roller coaster, there's a good reason for that. This is information that comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in the United States here. And it's kind of a generic model for what happens when people go through a disaster. And you can see that it really looks like you're on a roller coaster. I heard a very, I think, telling remark about models like this. The comment was that stage theories are almost always wrong, but they're almost always useful for understanding. And so this is not meant to necessarily represent your personal experience, but generally speaks to how people go through traumatic events. And so if we look back to that pre-disaster, that would be before March of 2020, when we were all kind of minding our own business. And then suddenly we were in the midst of a pandemic. And we moved into that heroic phase. And you might remember that as people were singing songs about healthcare workers and calling them heroes. And in our part of the world, we had jets flying over our hospitals, commemorating the work of our healthcare professionals. And that tends to be really inspiring, but it only lasts so long. And as the pandemic wore on, we started moving into that very steep decline that we call that period of disillusionment, where we realize that this is not going away anytime soon, and people get fatigued and lethargic. And at some point that bottoms out and begins to move in the right direction towards reconstruction. And we'd like to think that because we now have some vaccinations on board and people are beginning to get vaccinated across the world, that's probably where we are, is moving towards the upward part of that graph. But as you can see, it's not a straight line. There is little places where we dip down again, and maybe those are points where we learn about new variants of this particular virus. So this is just a model for you to think about, and perhaps you can relate to some of these phases. You can move on to the next slide, Chrissy. So one of the things that Rich and I would like to share with you is the results of a large survey done with nurses. This was done about 90 days ago, looking at the mental health and wellness of nurses. And Chrissy, you could pull up the first polling question here. So the slide reflects one of the questions that was asked on this nationwide survey about what are the emotions that you have felt in the last 14 days in your role as a nurse? And so this was last December, so about 90 days ago. Certainly we were in very dark times. And as you answer the polling question, I would just ask you to think about, what do you think were the top 2 highest ranking feelings reported? And Chrissy, I'll defer to you when you think we've got enough folks who have answered that will give us an idea of how closely the group today is able to predict the 13,000 nurses that responded to this survey.
All right, we'll just give it a few more moments. We're at about 65% voted. Make sure you're getting those votes in. All right, we'll go ahead.
Wow. So it looks like exhausted and overwhelmed were the clear leaders. Looks like hopeful came in third, which is hopeful. Exhausted and overwhelmed. Great. Well, let's actually go to the next slide and see how close our group was to the 13,000 nurses that answered this. Looky there. So this survey of 13,000 US nurses asked in the past 14 days, what have you experienced? And you can see that nearly 3/4 of our nursing colleagues reported feeling exhausted, and almost 2/3 reported feeling overwhelmed. And close behind was anxious, unable to relax, irritable. I would also direct your attention a little down further to the blue, because this is going to matter a little bit later in our presentation. But when nurses were asked, in the last 14 days, have you felt like your work has meaning? Only about 1/3 of nurses were feeling that way in December of 2020. Optimism was quite low. Only about 1 in 4 nurses reported feeling optimistic about the future. So definitely you all on the webinar today are very highly attuned to the rest of our nursing colleagues around the country. So we can move to the next slide, Chrissy. So the survey also asked, in the past 14 days, have you experienced an increase in any of the following things? And the first thing was that about 2/3 of nurses reported that they were having trouble sleeping, or in some cases, sleeping too much. And about 4 in 10 reported overeating. I'll just tell you parenthetically that the American Psychological Association came out with their 2021 report that they do annually called Stress in America. And this just came out in the month of March, so it's hot off the presses. And one of the things that this survey showed was that about 42% of people, so very close to this 40%, reported having gained weight during the pandemic. The average weight gain was 29 pounds. So not insignificant. You can see that difficulties in relationships and increased personal responsibilities, also things that our nurses were struggling with in the last 14 days. You can go to the next slide. So this is an interesting slide here. On the left, in the light blue, are things that the nurses in this survey reported that they were doing to try to strengthen their well-being. So coping mechanisms, ways to increase their resilience. And on the right-hand side were things that they had hope to begin doing, or at least continue doing in the future. And we highlighted a couple here because in a moment, Rich is going to talk about some well-being strategies. But I think it's telling that about 4 in 10 nurses said, yes, they have used exercise or physical activity to try to cope. But almost 3/4 said, that would be a really good thing to try to do in the future. So the difference between kind of knowing what to do and actually doing it was quite disparate there. Same thing a little bit lower down. Slightly more than 1/4 of nurses said, I'm trying to cope by maintaining a healthy diet. But almost 2/3 of nurses said, that's not a bad idea. I really probably should do more of that. And I think this goes back to Rich's first slide about how nurses as a group, God bless you, are really good at taking care of others. And maybe there's a little room for improvement for taking care of yourselves. You can go to the next slide. And this was still part of the same survey, 13,000 nurses asked to respond from strongly disagree to strongly agree on a number of statements. And the one I want to draw your attention to is that second one. The statement was, I put the health, safety, and wellness of my patients before that of my own. And that was the second highest response, that people were strongly agreeing to that. And the math converts to about 65% of nurses said that they strongly agreed that they put the health and safety of their patients ahead of their own. So again, if there's a theme developing here that Rich and I want to sensitize you to, this is really a time in our professional careers to be taking care of ourselves. And I think there's one more slide, Christy, that I'll go over, and then I'll hand it back to Rich. So just so you're aware of this survey, a little bit of the demographics, it was almost 13,000 nurses, but I do want to be clear that this was nurses in the United States. And so we'll be interested to hear feedback from our international friends, whether that is relevant or seems similar in your part of the world. The survey was mostly white, about 4 out of 5 were Caucasian. So people of color made up about 20% of that survey. This was not a group of rookie nurses or new nurses. More than half were aged 45 years or older and had been in the nursing profession for some time. And then lastly, we just want to point out that even though today we're gathering rural nurses from around the country and around the world, this survey was mostly urban nurses in larger hospitals. So we will certainly try to learn from you as we go on, whether that data is about the same or worse or maybe better than some of our urban colleagues. So Rich, I think I will hand it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. So in a moment, we'll do another polling question, but we really wanted to pause here now that you've had a chance to see a couple of the data points that Jeff has highlighted and really reflect on how does that data speak to you in terms of matching with your experience or the experience of your colleagues or not. So the opportunity to think about the thoughts and feelings or images that come to mind when you look at the different elements that Jeff highlighted. And also acknowledging, to Jeff's point about this survey data came largely from larger hospitals in urban areas. And we know there is a very much a uniqueness to rural life, but certainly healthcare in rural areas. And so that's a couple of questions we would invite you to ponder, and certainly can put some responses in the chat box as well. So Christy, we'll go ahead and pull up the polling question and get going on the responses. The A would be spot on. That data really matches with my experience or those around me. The other option, I can relate to some of it, but not all of it. And then the third is does not match my experience at all or the experience of those around me. We'll give a couple moments to do the poll.
We'll just give it one more moment where it looks like almost everyone has answered.
Okay, so it looks like, thank you for those of you that did the polling question. Looks like about 65% can really relate to the data and matching the experience. And a third that can relate to some of it. So it sounds like hopefully that there was some relevancy there to the data that we've presented again from your nursing colleagues from around the United States. So Chrissy, we'll go to the next slide and do a little bit. We could do a whole webinar on life in rural communities and practicing in those areas and healthcare, but certainly tying together the data that was presented by Jeff on COVID-19 and impact on nursing, and then looking at the additional dynamic of the reality of rural nursing in trying times. And so we know that in rural or smaller communities, it's a very unique experience. And sometimes there's an insider versus outsider dynamic where you're either from here or you're not. And oftentimes we joke around that if you move into a smaller community, you're not moving into 111 Maple Street, you're moving into Mr. and Mrs. Anderson's old house. And so there's just some uniqueness to life in rural areas. And that may or may not be the same or different outside of the United States, but certainly a lot of the experiences that we have would match that. And so that has its pros and cons. When you look at how the boundaries tend to be a little bit more permeable, and can be a fishbowl a little bit, and neighbors know neighbors, and so it's sometimes hard to have some of those boundaries that just aren't really as relevant in rural areas if you're practicing in urban areas. And so there's a vulnerability, kind of, again, in smaller areas being a little bit more under the microscope, and sometimes it can be awfully personal as well. The patient in room 3 is your 3rd grade teacher, and that makes a big difference. Or it's your neighbor that you're caring for, and it just becomes that closer circle. And so there's some real benefit to that, we know, but there can be limited resources and transportation issues and all those barriers that come along with that. And then lastly, I'll go back to what something Jeff had mentioned as well, in the psychological stages of disaster. And that's that sort of hero piece. And there is an interesting paradox to that. Certainly, I fully believe that those that work in healthcare are heroes. They do life-saving work every day. But looking at it from the lens of what do we hear and see in the media about superheroes, they typically don't care for themselves or don't take the time to do that. They rarely will have a weak moment in a film or a movie or a show. And so there's a real connotation with being a superhero, and what does that mean? And then one look at it is hero standing for high emotion and responsibility occupation. And so that probably summarizes a lot of roles in healthcare when you think about the high emotion and the incredible responsibility that all of us bear in caring for others. So Chrissy, we can go to the next slide, please. So we're going to shift now and look at one model of well-being. We think it's a fairly holistic model. There's a bunch of models out there. You can look, and there might be one that's that makes more sense to you, certainly. And we'll just key in on some elements of well-being, and then look at if a person was going to start to address one of those areas, how to get started, how to get some momentum going, and to make those promises to yourself. So taking a look at your own life in terms of your well-being and how are you doing through this pandemic. This model has 6 areas of the well-being: professional, physical, relational, financial, legal, spiritual, and emotional. And when people hear well-being, oftentimes they go right to physical well-being or even emotional well-being. But I think this model does a nice job of seeing it from a few different angles. Next slide, please.
I'm gonna actually share the results from
thank you.
beginnings, the first poll.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like with 10 being the best, about half came in at an 8. Okay, looks like that's the most. Thank you, Chrissy. It's good to get a sense of where people are at. Okay, so first of those 6 elements, we'll look at financial and legal health. And so all of us are very aware of the economic impact of the pandemic. I don't even know what the current estimates are. It's mind-boggling, but certainly many people lost businesses. People had their work hours changed or reduced. Some of the food items had an increased cost. Depending on the different countries, certainly in the United States, there was some stimulus packages, government assistance, and stress and uncertainty around that. And really the fate of many, many businesses in the US and around the world have an impact on everyone. Things like our retirement account, interest rates are really heavily dependent upon future economic uncertainty. Next slide, please. So when we look at professional health and relational health, and you ask people, what are the top, say, 5 things that you value the most or that matter to you the most? You'll get some variation, but these themes that we have: family, friends, faith, the work I do, my personal well-being. Those are quite popular for people when people will kind of self-describe their values and what matters most. And so the question for us to ponder is, what can I give to the things that matter most in my life? So of the things on the left are what matters or our values. The items on the right kind of play into that. So one could think of it as your checkbook and your calendar say an awful lot about what you value and what matters most to you, what you spend your time doing, what you spend your resources on. But don't forget personal contribution as well. So taking the time to mentor someone, taking the time to help someone move from one location to another, or donate a kidney, those are all important as well. So it's really about pausing and thinking about what matters most to me. What are the top, say, 5 values, what matters, and then looking objectively at what am I actually giving to those things? What am I contributing that either lines up or does not with what I value? Next slide, please. So we're going to queue up another polling question when it comes to emotional health and well-being. Emotional experience is very highly personal, and so your reaction to distress may be very different than mine. So we want to pause and just ask you at a glance, when you've experienced distress, what is sort of a very common emotional reaction that you experience once you've experienced distress? Is it irritability, anger, frustration, sadness, anxiety? It might be another emotion. So if you select other, feel free to put in the chat box the name of that emotion. So just in general, when you experience distress, what is your kind of default emotional reaction to that? Give just a moment until Chrissy lets me know that we've had a bunch of you respond to the poll.
All right, we're a little over half. We're getting there. Okay.
Okay, so it looks like almost half are identifying anxiety as kind of that typical emotional reaction to distress. Certainly when there's uncertainty, that creates an anxious emotional response for many of us. About a third are really relating to irritability when we're faced with that distress. Okay, thank you. So next we'll move into spiritual health. And we're defining that today as a quality of being concerned with the human spirit or soul as opposed to material or physical things. And that can be manifested in a number of different ways. We've listed some of them here: mindfulness, worship, meditation, and others. And so we've learned as human beings that we are not in control of many things in the world and our lives. And that really, I think, is even more apparent now, given what we've lived through over the past year. Individually, how have you found strength or energy or calmness in dealing with the things that seem out of our control? So there's some things out there that can help in this regard. There's some mindfulness apps and YouTube videos on mindfulness that are pretty easy to access and try out if it's something that you're interested in doing. There's all kinds of resources for calming and centering and refocusing. And some of these apps are actually some of these companies are making their apps free for healthcare professionals. So it doesn't hurt to do a little bit of research to see if you're interested in mindfulness and those software applications for those companies that offer a discount or make it free for healthcare professionals. So the other dynamic, obviously, with the pandemic is the inability to gather together. So when we think about a lot of the faith systems in the world involve some sort of group worship or group congregation in person. And so churches, temples, mosques, they've been closed at times for months at a time and switched to virtual or not have those services available. So what has worship and prayer and study looked like for you during this time? And then think about it, what's working for you? What would you like to continue to do in this regard? Or what maybe you want to go in a different direction with spiritual health and well-being? What's something that you would want to start doing or stop doing? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. In the context of your place of worship and the people you worship with. What does the new normal look like for you? What would be the healthiest new normal in this part of your life and your well-being? And then we just wanted to share the sort of common serenity prayer that sort of captures that whole idea of our human existence and our lack of control over a lot of things, and really being able to accept that and to cope with that. Next slide. Okay, so for physical health, probably nothing new in terms of information. This is very common guidelines from American Heart Association and places like that in terms of taking good care of your physical health. Obviously, adequate sleep. We noticed on the survey that is an issue. And so these are just general recommendations for your personal health. Certainly there might be some changes that wouldn't apply to you, or these guidelines would not apply to you. Don't want to make it sound like it's for everybody, but these are some general guidelines to work towards or work from. Again, if you're not doing any aerobic activity, I would not recommend doing 150 minutes today. It's a deal where you want to start small and gradually build up from there. And then I think we all have most of this knowledge up here about healthy food choices and the stuff that's good for us and the stuff that's not. So today is not about you passing a quiz in terms of what is good for you and what's not. I think it's really about getting tuned into these general guidelines and then reflecting on of this area of my well-being, what is going well? What do I want to continue to do? What do I want to start doing? Maybe get back on track with, say, diet. What do I want to stop doing? People have picked up habits, especially over the past year, that cause a little bit of pause and concern and reflection to really look at where do I want to go now in this piece. So people can think about cutting down on caffeine, talking about committing to an exercise program, how to get started, doing the research on how to go in that direction. And then, the sleep thing for a lot of people, it's the screen time all evening, and then trying to shut down your mind can be a difficult thing to do. So knowing about those barriers. Next slide, please. So we'll just pause here for a moment. I've talked a little bit of language around stop, start, and continue. And that's really about, a lot of people feel overwhelmed when we're faced with, I want to make some changes. I want to make a bunch of changes. Where do I even start or stop? And so thinking about the things you're already doing, what you want to do next certainly helps with that self-motivation. And so we'll go a little bit deeper here in the next slide on self-directed goal setting. So the goals that you set for yourself sometimes are the most successful. And so we know that knowledge alone is not enough. There is a huge gap between knowledge of these parts of well-being and actually putting them into action. And it's my bias. I'm a big fan of self-efficacy theory. And so I think that self-efficacy has a big part to play in bridging the gap between knowledge and action. And so quite simply, self-efficacy just refers to building confidence in my abilities to achieve a certain goal. And so how do we do that? And when you're looking at self-directed goal setting from a well-being context, one helpful way to look at that is to make those self-directed goals as specific as possible. Have them be time limited. The SMART is an acronym for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time. For a lot of people, it's a weekly self-directed goal that responds to each of those 5 elements, so that it's very clear at the end of the week if I was successful or not. Do I need to adjust my plan? And that's where we get into the confidence ruler. So if you go down the path of creating a goal for yourself for the coming week, and you answer all the questions about specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time, on that scale of 0 to 10, how confident or how sure are you that you can get that plan done, that will reveal a lot. That's your gut feeling. So if it's a 3, you know that you have some work to do to adjust your plan or your goal. If it's a 7, 8, or a 9, then the likelihood is that you've created an achievable goal for yourself. And just a small caveat, achievable and realistic are pretty similar concepts. The way that I think about this is achievable, think about through the lens of how much of whatever am I doing right now? So if I'm not doing any of the exercise, then what's achievable for me in this coming week would not be probably the 150 minutes. It's going to be a small step towards a positive change. Where realistic really talks about realistically, with all that I have going on this coming week, what can I give time to on this part of my well-being? What's realistic for me, given all the context, given all that's on my plate and the other demands, what's reasonable? The idea is that there's not a goal that's too, there's not a such thing as a goal that's too small. It's being successful with those small steps. Next slide, please. So next, we're going to turn it back over to Jeff to talk about opportunities for growth in the midst of challenges.
Thanks, Rich, and thanks everybody for hanging with us through this hour. I have 2 things that I want to share with you in the next few minutes that really speak to moving forward or bouncing forward through this pandemic. We've talked to this point about how have you been doing this past year compared to pre-pandemic, but I want to introduce to you a couple of important concepts that are near and dear to my heart as we move forward, hopefully into brighter times. So Chrissy, if you want to move the slide forward. The first thing I want to introduce to you is a concept called post-traumatic growth. And some of you may be familiar with this. Certainly as nurses and healthcare professionals, I'm quite confident you're familiar with post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress being the psychiatric concerns that sometimes occur in people who've been exposed to trauma or disaster. And certainly this past year has been traumatic for many, many millions of people around the world. But what doesn't get quite as much press or attention is a concept called post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic growth, or PTG, refers to the experience of positive changes that can occur as the result of the struggle with major life crises, traumas, and disasters. Now, post-traumatic growth doesn't mean that people don't suffer or that trauma is good or desirable, but rather that out of suffering comes new possibilities, and that from adversity we can gain strength. And like it or not, COVID has been so pervasive in our world that it really has in some ways offered us new ways to think about our lives, our families, our work as healthcare professionals, and our future. And so post-traumatic growth really talks about how the struggle with the crisis and not the trauma itself produces growth. And post-traumatic growth has 5 domains. And I want to just go over these very quickly with you. And as I go over each one, ask that you sort of think about how this resonates with you over the past 12 to 13 months. So the first domain of post-traumatic growth is a deeper relationship with others, meaning that trauma brings with it a greater potential for closeness to others, and in many cases, a deeper sense of compassion for those with whom we share loss. And whether you've lost family members or you simply have been working on the front lines dealing with the losses that dictates, has this affected your relationship with others in deeper ways? The second domain is an openness to new possibilities in life, meaning that the impact of the trauma of COVID-19 opens doors to new relationships, new activities, and new insights that can fill the vacancy of the loss in ways that we had not previously considered. So I'd ask you to think about what new possibilities in your life have you encountered in the last year. The third domain is a greater sense, you want to go back? Thank you, Chrissy. A greater sense of personal strength and abilities, meaning that simply surviving the worst time that we know, and of course, the last year has been the worst time for many, many people, but surviving that worst time offers us evidence of our personal strength in the context of adversity. So paradoxically, the more vulnerable we have been forced to become, the stronger we have become. The fourth domain, as Rich talked about a little bit ago, is spirituality. And we see that in post-traumatic growth, people have a stronger sense of spirituality. And for better or for worse, trauma changes the way that we understand ourselves and our existence as really mortal human beings. And for some people, that creates a deeper connection to something transcendent, some higher power, which can be a source of great strength moving forward. And the fifth domain is a greater appreciation for life. A commonly reported change in post-traumatic growth is for individuals to value simple things in life more than ever. And apparently the more important things become less important. An example of this, and I don't know how it was outside the United States, but for a period of time, there was a shortage on toilet paper. And gosh, 13 months ago, whoever thought that we would be worrying about whether toilet paper was available to us when we needed it? Those an example of the simple appreciations of life, of things that maybe will change us in permanent ways. Okay, you want to move on to the next slide, Chrissy. The last thing I'm going to talk about before I hand it back over to Rich is I want to share with you a little bit about a real seminal work that was done in the mid-1950s by a psychiatrist and neurologist by the name of Viktor Frankl. Many of you may be familiar with him, maybe not. He is the author of a book entitled Man's Search for Meaning, which has been hailed as one of the 100 most important books ever written in the history of humankind. Frankl was of Jewish descent, and he lived in Austria. And during World War II, he and his wife, his siblings, and his parents were rounded up and placed in different Nazi concentration camps. Frankl ended up spending 3 years in various concentration camps, including Auschwitz. In fact, sadly, he was the only member of his family to survive World War II. But being the consummate physician and psychiatrist that he was, he spent his time in the concentration camps drawn to trying to figure out what was it that helped people endure, that helped people to survive until the liberation from the Allies. And initially he thought that that which would be the most resilient would be the youngest concentration camp prisoners, the biggest, the strongest, or maybe those who had the access to the most food. But it turns out that was not the case. In fact, what he found out and then later wrote in his book after World War II ended was that the ones who survived were the people who maintained a sense of hope and meaning and purpose during their incarceration. For Frankl, his hope and meaning came from imagining on a daily basis that after the war he would rejoin his wife and they would go to Paris, where they would sip coffee on the streets of Paris. And he also knew that he was going to write a manuscript about his experience, and he would write it on scraps of paper that he would keep hidden from the Nazis. On one occasion, his manuscript was discovered and destroyed, and he started again. For him, that was part of the purpose of his adversity. You can move on to the next slide. And so Frankl introduced a concept in his book that we want to share with you, and that is a will to meaning. And Frankl believed that human beings, even in our darkest of hours, and my goodness, this last year has been among the darkest of hours for many, many millions of people, that even in our darkest of hours, that our ability to sustain ourselves and to find adversity within to find resiliency within adversity comes from establishing and sustaining a sense of meaning. As he wrote in his book, he said, those people who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. If you want to move to the next slide, a couple of quotes from Frankl that you would find in his book. He says, when we're no longer able to change a situation, we're challenged to change ourselves. And everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. And I just want to circle back with you to the survey we presented at the beginning as we're talking about meaning, that 2/3 of nurses in that survey last December reported that their work was lacking meaning. And so very much a concerning observation. So if you want to go to the next slide, and this will be the last slide that I will share with you. Frankl talked about asking yourself some questions, and I've adjusted some of those questions here to reflect COVID-19 to help you find meaning and purpose in the tragedy that has been the last 13 months that we've called COVID-19. And we will make the slide deck available to you, so you don't need to feel like you need to write this down unless you wish. But some questions to consider. Has anything positive come out of this experience for yourself and for others in the past year? We know what the negative has been. Has anything positive come out of this? Is there anything that you now know in April 2021 that you could not possibly have known in March 2020 that will serve you moving forward? What are you better prepared to do? What do you now appreciate about your life that in March of 2020 was the farthest thing from your consideration, but now you hold dear? What are some valuable things that you have learned about yourself and about your coworkers and your family and your friends that sadly you could not have learned in any other way that might help to give you some meaning and purpose in the tragedy of the last year? And finally, how are you more resilient in this past year? And how can you carry that resiliency forward as you move through this pandemic? And so, Rich, I think I'll hand it back to you to carry us over the finish line here.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. I guess the comment that I would make just based on as we wrap up here, when I referred earlier to these self-directed goals, I think I need to acknowledge that some of these, when it comes to well-being PPE, involve lifestyle changes. And those are hard. They're hard for you, they're hard for me. And so self-forgiveness and getting back on track is all part of it. And so we just wanted to provide a little bit of a framework for those of you on the call and your colleagues to think about when you want to go in this direction, so that you're not overwhelmed. Because all of us have a list of shoulds a mile long. And so it's really overwhelming at times. And where do I start? So we hope to give a little bit of a framework and structure to that as well. Next slide, please. So in summary, we've went over the survey data that certainly supports the notion that nurses have been heavily impacted by COVID-19. We've polled those of you on the webinar, and a lot of what we presented you could relate to. And one of the things that we're most concerned about is that number of nurses responding that they had a lack of meaning in their work, and certainly how that relates to Jeff's talking about finding meaning in those trying times. But then we looked at one model of well-being with those 6 key elements and SMART goals. And then Jeff wrapped up with meaning and purpose when it comes to trying times and finding meaning and value there. So that is our summary of the content that we wanted to cover for today. If we could go to the next slide, is just a image of a nurse from September 13th of 1918. That was during the influenza pandemic of 1918. And so we're going to pause now and welcome questions.
We do have another minute for question. I'm not seeing any open questions in the question and answer box, but if you do have ones that you would like to have Rich and Jeff answer, please go ahead and place those in the box. So I'm seeing a question that says, what do rural nurses see that city nurses might not?
That's a great question. I wonder if those of you on the call would be able to respond to that a little better than me.
So I see Kristen's also written equipment, PPE, logistical challenges. I think another piece from the emotional side from my past experience of working in a rural environment is that you're caring for your family, your neighbors, members of your community, maybe more than a nurse who works in a urban environment. And that can take a significant psychological toll. And also, I think, puts more burden, I have felt, on the nurse who's practicing as well.
This is Jeff. I would just follow up, Audrey, to what you're saying. Actually, Rich and I were chatting about this in preparation for this presentation, that I've practiced in a town of 8,000 people for about 30 years as a psychologist. So the overlapping relationships, as Rich said, are both a challenge and a joy. But one of the things that I think really struck home for me was what I call rural accountability. In other words, we all have an accountability to our profession, to the law, to the ethics of our particular guilds. But in small towns, there's also a rural accountability that if you're going to be a member of this tight-knit community of a small number of people, you are expected to contribute to that community in ways that are not so anonymous as it might be in a town of 1 million people, where when you leave work, you're not going to see anybody else at all till you come back to work that you know. But I think that is both a joy of rural practice, but also a challenge is how do you keep all of those things straight in your head when the community may demand things of you that may push some of the ethical boundaries around that we are required to follow.
Kristen did type into the chat that the loss of a friend or neighbor is harder to compartmentalize than a total stranger. And I will agree with you, Kristen. So we're almost out of time, but I want to take a few minutes to wrap up. And remember that you may stay on to ask additional questions. First, I'd like to thank Rich and Jeff for all of their great insight today. The Global Rural Nurse Exchange Network and the Rural Nurse Organization really appreciates you taking your time out of your busy schedules to share your expertise with you. Just want to remind you that you will receive a follow-up message as a participant today that will give you a link to the recording and the slides that have been presented, any unanswered questions and answers, as well as a list of resources and the GRNEN social media links. We want you to feel free to share this with your colleagues who might benefit from today's information. And we also ask that you let us know what other subjects are important to you. There will be a 2-minute survey that you'll receive along with the recording links. And with that, we'd like to know, are there other topics that the GRNEN can bring forth? Now, if we didn't get to your question or you've got another question, we want you to stay on the call to be able to speak with Rich and Jeff. I will send responses to questions with the recording links. We thank each of you for joining us today. We hope that you found it helpful and will be willing to join us for some of our future webinar series. Follow us on social media. The links have been placed in the chat, but they will also be sent to you by email with the follow-up. So thank you to each of you for being a part of today's discussion. We hope you have a great rest of your day.